Bheki Cele, the police minister, has vowed door-to-door searches by the tactical response team. Not good enough?
It is part of the toolkit that should be looked at broader than just raids. Let me start with the reality. You know, a police report on firearms control and management in South Africa in 2016 highlighted that the loss of firearms from civilians and state institutions is the most significant source of illegal firearms in South Africa. So it's not firearms that come across our border. It's not firearms that magically appear illegally. It is firearms that are sourced from those two primary sources. Now, if we acknowledge that being the case, can you imagine our civil liability individually or by class actions in gang-related areas or for the use of those firearms that are so sourced, whether we tackle civilians under such litigation or state institutions? Now, this on its own calls for greater accountability and answers into as to what are we doing to find back those firearms? Where are those guns? Now, if one looks at the scale of these losses, it would, in my opinion, necessitate us starting to look at the need for specialized focus and investigation with the purpose of tracing all of those firearms and prosecuting whatever crimes or investigating all crimes that were committed with them. And not only stop at possession, but investigate the whole chain back to where it started. Now, that is going to need, at the scale it's required, just to give you an idea, this pattern didn't change. In the 2019-2020 financial year, there were 8,680 firearms that were lost in this category. Of that, 8,007 were from civilians and 637 from the SAPs. Now, a single gun, we look at numbers and numbers abstractly, but think about it this way. In the Prinsloo case, which I was involved in leading the particular project investigation at the time, there was one firearm that circulated between three areas in the Cape Flats that killed 15 people in 2 months, including one of my investigators who was involved in the investigation into the Prinsloo matter. So we must start humanizing these statistics in terms of its impact to see what our problem is. So stricter gun control that also looks at the way the civilians are handling their firearms and safeguarding it, and looks at the state or any government department, including the SAPs, is becoming necessary. And the current moves to repeal the legislation is therefore part of the urgency of dealing with a problem. So
Look, I've got to come in here and just pose this question to you. Bheki Cele did have the idea to try and restrict gun ownership in general, and many gun owners were up in arms saying, hang on, you're blaming the victims, because whilst it's important to establish the full chain of ownership from the original licensed holder to how it lands up in criminal hands, many gun owners will say, well, hang on, it's not as if we handed these things over. They were taken from us, usually by force, using another gun.
The first question is, many of these cases involve losses in public spaces. Now, this is an important thing, I think, for us. Firstly, I want to start off by public spaces. Many of these guns get lost in public spaces. Now, think of it this way. Two things that are important. Firstly, the majority of the victims, actually 90% of it, even more than that of the victims, are not gun owners of the eventual crimes that happen in this particular case. Those of us who get murdered and maimed by these guns are essentially black, and I believe black inclusive. I use it in the legal sense of the word. It is us who die, us who can't afford to own those things from that negligence and from those losses from the middle class.
Yeah, but is it hold on, I mean, is it that simple to blame the people who themselves are victims of crime?
we are not blaming the people who are victims. We are saying it's a bit of a big ask to expect me, who is not a gun owner, who traverses public spaces, it's much like smoking zones, and to trust you, who has a lethal instrument in your hand, traversing that public and acting individually when the situation requires it, because a gun has a risk to bystanders. Let's not be clear about that. And no single competency test that you did 10 years ago and a few shootings on a shooting range will keep you at the high standard that is required to act in that context. So for that reason, we need to, like with smoking, if we could do it with smoking, it's also of long-term consequence to us to our health. It makes sense that certain areas to protect me who don't own a gun.
702.
More than a radio station.
Let's walk the talk.